Okay, so we're taking a look at a foundational reading on how to think about strategy under conditions of uncertainty from the Harvard Business Review, written by Courtney Kirkland and Vigoury. Um, so they have about a three-part model, and it begins with this notion of when you talk about uncertainty, you have to be clear on how much uncertainty you think there is in that environment. Think about that model I showed you before with the different layers of environments, and the amount of uncertainty in those can vary. And so they suggest that it's useful to think about 4 levels of uncertainty. And so here's the first 2. The first one is in which you have a clear enough future such that a single forecast is precise enough for determining strategy, and then the typical traditional strategy toolkit tools that you would find in an MBA program can be applied. And an example would be trying to develop a strategy against a new entrant in the airline business that might be featuring low cost. And so that's a very straightforward entity looking to have an impact in your business area, and it's clear enough about what to do that you can apply simple analysis to it. It's one model correctly applied, and it defines what's going on. The next level of complexity is one in which there are multiple alternate futures, but such that you can actually define a set of possible outcomes for these 3, in this case, 3 different states of nature. And so you can do some decision analysis that says if we adopt course of action 1 or course of action 2 or course of action 3, we can sort of evaluate what the expected payoff is. We might be able to use things like game theory or option valuation models to determine what the probabilities of outcomes are and what the risk reward features are, how much an option or an insurance would cost, and we could make an analytical decision based on expected outcomes, based on those 3, in this case, well-defined possible approaches or possible decisions. And so this might be applied in something like capacity strategies for a chemical plant, in which we decide how much we want to invest in, small, medium, or large, given an environmental environment or policy regime that was stable, and then we could decide what the reward would be for those different levels of capitalization, and then we could make a business decision on the basis of that to see which one had the best reward to risk profile. You might also see that with long distance carrier strategy trying to enter a deregulated local services market. So there are different levels of exposure that they could have, or different strategies, each of which could be viable, and then we might do some wargaming to determine which strategy is the most appropriate and give us the kind of returns we want for the amount of capital that we're interested in putting in. So those are the first 2 levels. So the third level of complexity is one in which there is a range of futures available, but which don't really conform to separate and distinct categories like on the previous level. So any one of the futures in here is certainly reasonable and possible. And so we can't define like a million different scenarios or a million different decision points. There's just too much to compute or too many variables going on. So we might have to do some different analytical approaches like latent demand research, in which we might do some surveys to determine how many people would respond to different categories of product marketing or service offerings. We might do different schools of thought on technology forecasting to see how probable breakthrough technology might be in the next 5, 10, or 15 years, and then use that to guide what kind of time frame would be appropriate for us to consider. We might do scenario planning, in which we take a representative sample of possible scenarios on the left, in the middle, and on the right, and then develop a set of strategies and see how those strategies might perform in each of those different future scenarios. So there's a lot of future thinking going on in there. And then based on based on how well a different strategy might perform in all of these scenarios, we might make a decision that way. But we might not have we're not certain about which particular scenario comes about, but all of them are kind of possible scenarios, but with different policy parameters and variables. And so we can test against those, because in large corporations, a lot of times we've got to commit to strategies before it's very clear about how certain policy outcomes might unfold. And so we have to be able to put things in motion and then just see what kind of weather is going to come up. So what kind of rigging do you want on your sailboat? Not that you're going to go around the world with, not knowing what specific kind of weather patterns you're going to get. So you have to launch before you find out exactly what that weather might be. Or maybe the journey is so long that we're going to experience a number of different scenarios. So in this kind of uncertainty, what's important is getting a representative sample of possible future scenarios so that you really provide a stress test or a legitimate test of the different strategies you propose. In the fourth degree of uncertainty, we can't even say that much about the future, that the variables are so many and that the range of possibilities are so great that we can't even really say anything about what the future might hold. So we have no basis to forecast that future. And so we might do things like nonlinear dynamic models or use artistic models like analogies and pattern recognition that might suggest things that could happen. And so then we could carefully enter that market, maybe with low risk ideas, or consider something like the Russian market in 1992 when the wall came down and Soviet Union disappeared. Nobody had any kind of historical basis to decide what the future of Russia might hold, and yet there was clearly opportunities for investment, but which came with high risk. And so how you navigate through that kind of true ambiguity takes on a different characteristic than these other three levels that do support some kind of analysis. Well, once we've decided which of those four categories of uncertainty seem to be appropriate, the next thing we can look at in this, according to this model, is the idea of three strategic postures that we might adopt. In the first one, we're large enough that we could shape the future. So we want to try to play a leadership role and then take actions that actually try to shift the future in a certain way. You have to be large, you have to be influential. It costs money and capital to do that, and it may not be certain. People may not want to follow your role, but trying to shape the future is certainly one of the postures that we could adopt, and it would lead you to take certain kinds of first mover steps. The middle posture is one in which we would be adaptive. So we're not going to commit to being leaders, but rather we want to do things that allow us to use speed, agility, and flexibility to see what the emerging trends are and get there first. And then, so it's a little bit of wait and see, but also try to respond in time and to be first at responding. Now, the third posture is one we call reserving the right to play, in which we don't even commit to early activities, and we're simply buying just enough options or creating just enough infrastructure so that if something positive begins to develop that we could rely on, that we delay our decision until that happens, and then we cash in our option and then take action on the capability that we bought. So it really says how big and how large and how soon do you want to go. There's the shape the future, there's the reserve the right to play, and then this middle one in which we're kind of like trying to surf the wave, but without trying to exert force to shape the world. So once you've sorted out what that posture is going to be, which can be driven by the degree of uncertainty that you saw, we might then say, what's in a portfolio of actions that's appropriate for us? So there are three different kinds of actions that we could develop. One might be a no regret move, in which, let's say that you did that scenario analysis and you said there's four different possible futures, and we found something that we could do that no matter which scenario unfolds, we would always have a positive outcome. And one of those might be like investing in the professional development of your people so that you not only hire and retain the best people, but you're developing them as you go, which creates loyalty and capability in your workforce, and then that should help you prepare for any future possible contingency. Well, that's always going to be a no regret move, and so it's always a good thing to do. So that might be one that we say, well, until the scenario firms up or we get a little more certainty, we're at least going to protect our people and invest in their capabilities and their education. So we'll always do that. That's what we mean by a no regret move, that we can't imagine a world in which that's not a good idea. The second category are options in which you try to look at a structured decision that looks like this. You have a certain cost that's represented along this line, the cost of the option. There are some scenarios in which you have a limited loss. So you buy it here, and then maybe if it doesn't pay off, then you only lose the cost of the option. So a very controlled loss. It might be, hey, for $5,000, I reserve the right to add to my position if this thing starts taking off, and I hold that position for a certain amount of time. And now if that option expires unexercised, then I lose the value of the option. It expires worthless. But if it turns out that that guy really was a success, I now have the ability to buy more shares at a certain price well below the current market value, and then that's where I can cash in that option and then capture this outsized profit. So what I'm doing in options is try to pay a small fee for the right to act later once the information comes in. If I compare the region under the line here, that's all my projected profits, and then my projected losses would be under this line, and so you can see I have an unequal reward to risk ratio that's tilted in my favor. And so if I can put a time dimension on that, I might say, hey, this idea, if it works out, could be worth a fortune, and we'll know in about 6 months. So I buy an option that says for the next 6 months, I will reserve the right to be able to buy at a lower than market value, and they get that money and they can use that to develop their ideas, and then it gives me the right to participate if the thing actually pays off. So that's sort of what you do as a venture capitalist. So if I have unequal or asymptotic reward to risk, then I have options that I can put in my portfolio of actions. And the final one might be one where I don't even have the ability to do an option. It's sort of all or nothing right now, and I have to take big bets and become a big player in this in this enterprise or in this opportunity. And if it pays off, I win big, and if it doesn't pay off, I lose big. And now I've got to figure out how I can stack the deck so that my probability of gains are larger than my probability of losses, but I recognize that it consumes a significant amount of my capital. So I have to be very careful in my analysis before I'm going to make a big bet. So a portfolio of action then really is a collection of building blocks that takes these kinds of actions and blends them together based on this uncertainty and the posture that I've taken. And so I can create multiple actions or decisions in my overall course of action. And so the example that they offer, and I'm not going to read all this to you, but is that a regional bank is confronting uncertainties in electronic commerce, does their little strategic analysis according to that model. They identify the nature and the extent of uncertainties. They choose a posture. They build a portfolio of actions, and then they actively manage that. And then as the environment starts to change and information comes back on how well they're doing, they can then adjust their decisions. They can add or subtract to activities in that portfolio of actions. And now what they've done is they've applied this particular model. So I say all this simply to say this is one of the ways in which we might choose a model to analyze the strategic opportunities available to a company. So we'll talk about other models in this course. The Porter model, the Diamond framework, the supply chain management, value chain analysis, SWOT models, PEST models, that RAFT model, that model I showed you before. But here's another model that's available to us that can certainly be used in any of our DBs.